had at least some people come and go, so I know at least a few of you have stood up, moved your legs and things like that. And since this is about people, maybe if you haven't come in and out of the room, stand up just quickly for a second so that you stay awake and break out that post-lunch stress thing. Come on, take just a second. All right. So today I'm quite excited to share a talk that really nicely follows what I was presenting earlier today. So for those of you who are back for round 2, thank you for your trust in me to keep you entertained and informed. And we're looking at a survey we did and information investigating anglers' perceptions on what needs to be addressed for the sustainability of Swedish recreational fishing and who's responsible for each of these things. And as was well presented by that cartoon Valerio had up in the plenary yesterday and in quite a few talks, we know the people engaged in recreational fishing are very diverse, and they have a lot of things that they expect out of this activity and a lot of different reactions to management, different reactions to what's going on in the state of fisheries, things like that. And that this is important as we're thinking about their interactions that they have between themselves and the ecological system. But anglers are often the ones who are speaking up about what's happening and driving what's going on in the social political system that actually governs our laws we enforce around people, but also the actions we take to enhance or restore or do things around the ecological side of recreational fisheries and ecosystems as a whole. Now, as researchers, we were wonderfully presented with a list of 100 questions divided into 10 themes to investigate, to help prepare recreational fisheries for future changes and to make them sustainable moving forward. And it's quite fun to have a few of the authors of this here and to be talking to them today. And this is something that we as researchers can understand why we want to look into these different topics. But in the Swedish context, we can also use those 10 themes as potential areas to look at as places where we need to improve actually what we're doing with fisheries management. And we want to know what Swedish anglers think is most important to be addressed as far as making these fisheries sustainable moving forward. And so we asked what importance do they place on each of these 10 themes, as well as what stakeholder groups or institutions should be responsible or do they think are responsible for actually taking action on each of these topics. And then we also tried to tease out if there are any angler groups or particular fisheries where certain themes are maybe more important or certain management groups are not picking up the slack or taking on the role that maybe they should in addressing them. To do this, we distributed a survey to members of the National Angling Association where we translated the themes and renamed them to make them more angler relevant, as in the paper and the initial topic themes. It's a bit much to present to just a regular person, have them understand how it relates to them, as well as asking questions about how and where they fish and things like that to tease out the other material we were looking for. Our respondents were biased towards men, but not overly biased, as I talked about in the presentation earlier, with an average age where they're quite mature, with quite a bit of fishing experience, and quite active as anglers, which in this context was something we were aiming for, as we were wanting people who have a pretty good picture of what's happening broadly in fishing in Sweden and could hopefully give us quite informed responses on what they think is maybe driving these themes and who actually is taking action on them as well. So with our first question, asking them for each of these themes, how important is it to be taking action, doing things, researching anything around each theme? At the top of the list, we had habitat, environmental problems, and regulations, which I find quite exciting when you think about, these are the most important things, addressing habitat issues, addressing environmental problems. These are things that don't just benefit the anglers themselves and fisheries. These are things that have spillover effects to the rest of society, to other parts of the ecosystem, which is quite a positive thing to see ranked at the top of the list. In the middle, we had data, governance, and outreach themes, but still ranked relatively highly in terms of importance. And then at the bottom, fishing pressure, bioeconomics, catch and release, and human dimensions, which, as we're asking the anglers, it's interesting to note that some of these things, particularly human dimensions, catch and release, fishing pressure, these are the things that the anglers themselves are actually doing and causing. And interesting to see that they're saying that those are significantly less important, although still important relative to the other 10 themes, or the other 6 themes there. Then, knowing this, we also want to know who do they think is or should be actually addressing each of these topics. And we want to know whether or how they rank themselves, or anglers as a whole, conservation-focused NGOs, in specific the National Angling Association, who they are members of, national and regional governments, who directly manage the open access fishing in the coasts and the largest lakes in the country, as well as in alpine areas, as well as the private fishing water owners, who manage over 2,000 individual fisheries, where they sell the licenses, set the regulations, make the majority of the decisions controlling access and things like that, as well as the recreational fishing industry, who plays a big role in potentially driving change and setting standards for who's in advertising, what are we actually seeing as anglers being promoted around us. So here, last question, how important are each of these actors? And it's quite a complicated, lots of information here, type graphic, but they're presented clockwise in order of decreasing importance. And I'll just focus in on a couple of things, and if we want to talk more about this, come track me down later and we can discuss more about what's going on. But to start with, the Angling Association, the NGO, that's the blue data points. Potentially you could ignore them because this is a group that's already part of supporting that NGO, so they're going to be expecting more of them. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have the lowest expectations of industry, which can maybe make sense. They don't have as much of a mandate in these cases, but water owners who actually control fishing activity, habitat enhancement across the bulk of fishing in the country were ranked as having the least importance in addressing each of these 10 themes. Diving in on a couple of key items, the second most important theme, anglers ranked their role as being least important here, but actually ranked the government's role as being higher than even the NGO, which is actively doing a lot of conservation and work and trying to address environmental problems. We have a similar pattern in the governance theme, where anglers gave the lowest score overall to themselves and the highest to governance, which makes sense, but could be indicating something of a disconnect between these groups and potentially a lack of agency, which we see in a lot of presentations that have been given in fisheries elsewhere, where anglers feel like they're not being listened to by those setting regulations and making decisions further up. And then, mostly because I have a background working on catch and release related topics and find it quite interesting, I'm happy to see anglers rating their role in catch and release related issues being quite high, at least acknowledging that they are the ones driving things there. And even though that wasn't something that they ranked as important as 8 of the other themes, they're at least acknowledging the role that they play, which is a positive thing moving forward. Then we also tried to look at any relationships between whether they're fishing in public or private water, where in the country they're fishing, what they're fishing for, and what gear they're using, to see if there are any interesting patterns or areas where certain themes were more or less important, or certain actors had a greater or lesser role. And we didn't actually find, or so far haven't found, any really meaningful, significant areas that stood out. And that might be partially because this is a relatively avid, somewhat selected for group of respondents. But we could find some significant differences around the why they're fishing and how they score importance and responsibility. Particularly looking at the average importance that they gave to these 10 themes, so how much needs to be done to address sustainability in fishing, that those with a higher score or higher motivation around experiencing nature, the challenge of fishing, relaxation, and social aspects of angling had significantly higher scores that they gave to the importance overall of addressing these things, which is also mirrored in how they viewed anglers' responsibility in addressing these themes. And then we had negative relationships with retention of catches, although those weren't significant. And similar to some of the stuff that I was talking about in the presentation this morning about social motivations around angling, it's interesting to see that there might be some connections between your social network and your willingness to engage in stewardship. And that communication factor, outreach, engagement, and building social capital is very important for achieving change in fisheries management and addressing challenges around us, not just with habitat and things like that, but you could apply that to a lot of different aspects of life as well. And so to wrap things up and summarize some of the key things that we're pulling out of this information, it's exciting to see that habitat and environmental issues are at the top of the list of importance. Hopefully this isn't just because of how big these issues are, but also that moving forward and addressing them, these are things that will benefit more than just fish and people who fish. But also interesting to see where anglers are downplaying their roles and what this might indicate for opportunities to increase their agency, and where maybe particularly environmental problems, we could be finding an opportunity to increase anglers' activity to reduce the impacts they have while they're fishing. And that it's surprising to see how low a responsibility level was placed on water owners as well as industry, especially considering how much control water owners have over what's done in fishing in this country. But that these things are also opportunities. People are having a low expectation of industry to address these things. It's an opportunity where industry may have a blank slate to actually step up as role models, as taking a leading edge to actually promote more fish-friendly gear, things like that, before maybe it's demanded of them by other agencies. And also, it's an opportunity for us to use this information potentially as leverage to approach those managing these fisheries, government, people who are fishing, and say, people are expecting you to be doing more on this particular issue, or they're saying you're not doing anything, but you are. Maybe you need to be doing a better job so that people believe that things are actually being done here, there, and elsewhere. And so I hope you can see this as an opportunity to look into the fisheries where you're working and hopefully find some parallels or interesting things that you can apply. And I'd like to talk to you more about any of this now and later today, tomorrow, the next few days. So thank you very much.
Right? Either that their anglers are seeing that there's habitat degradation and that's bothering them, or that they are educated and realize how important good habitat equals to good fishing. Do you have any feeling about why that sort of?
Yeah, that's one of the challenges with having to keep things simple enough to make the survey understandable and move forward. And so we do have to look at it both ways, whether that's something that is important for the future of fisheries or something that's important that has to be fixed for fisheries, if it's a response to thinking about more broad environmental issues, or if it is a local thing that they're thinking of. We can't really tease that out, but it's still an opportunity. Fixing habitat things pays dividends for a lot of different things, so it's could be positive as long as we're actually trying to address it. I think Aaron had to,
Individual anglers probably feel totally overwhelmed by all these big topics like habitat, environment, governance, and so on. So maybe it's angling associations that took over responsibilities.
It potentially, and that's part of where the different levels of responsibility they're placing on things and where they're putting the government having a role for addressing environmental problems and things like that. They're seeing who actually has the resources to do this. But at the other end of the spectrum, that's where I like talking to anglers in Sweden about topics like catch and release, where you're actually giving them agency to control something. That if they're thinking about climate change and things that are out of their control, and you tell them, if you can do this better, that fish is going to have a better chance of surviving, it'll grow into a bigger fish, have better reproduction, you'll have more fish. You can take some of these themes to give anglers a better sense of agency and go, okay, yeah, I'm actually doing things to make my fishery better, and that could have spillover effects on their willingness to engage with and address the stuff that feels like it's out of our hands.
In terms of, so great, thank you. In terms of clarifying responsibility as a term in surveys, just a little thought thing. You should perhaps differentiate between causal responsibility, so who's causally responsible for an outcome, poor fish stocks or something, and normative responsibility. So which actor is normally responsible for either dealing with past or future developments. I think if you avoid that, picture of responses, but
Yeah.
this is just something we should, as a community, think about in surveying.
Uh,
Causal and normative responsibility, two different things.
And I'm going to have to roll back in my head to how we phrased it in Swedish, to which way we were actually leaning to try and make it clear that we were wanting to know who should be doing something about it, because that was what we're aiming for in terms of information in this context.